Thank you very much, Peter. Okay, so you know that I'm a literary scholar, so I'll start by admitting that really until a couple of years ago, Thomas Fairfax was known to me primarily just as the addressee of Andrew Marvell's Upon Appleton House. Also, if anything, I was more interested in his daughter, Mary Fairfax. I always found it wonderful that Marvell's poetical paragon of virtue later overturned her engagement to the Earl of Chesterfield to marry George Villiers, the Duke of Buckingham. So really up until that point, my Fairfaxian engagement was a matter of footnotes and side interests. And I suppose that's how I sort of stumbled upon a reference to Fairfax's poetry. I was looking again at Upon Appleton House for my Lost Ground study, and I found a reference to his poetry. That reference did not tell me very much. Said he wrote some poetry, but it did point me in the direction of an edition of Fairfax's poetry produced in 1909 by Edward Bliss Reed. So I had a look at Reed's edition and became more interested, not actually because of what I found in it, but because of what I didn't. And here, with a bit of luck, we'll go to the website that I've been working on. Reed actually includes some rather pedestrian verse produced by Fairfax under the heading of the recreations of my solitude, and it includes poems on anger, on virtue, etc. He also includes Fairfax's translation of a poem on solitude by Saint-Amand, the French libertine poet, and it's a poem on solitude that is much more famously translated by Catherine Phillips. Reed also included 4 of Fairfax's psalm translations. Fairfax, however, translated the whole Psalter, and he also translated a variety of other biblical books, chapters, and verses. And in fact, Reed provides a very limited selection of Fairfax's poetry, and even then only selects from, kind of only takes his selections from one of the Fairfax poetry manuscripts. It's a 656-page manuscript in the Bodleian, and as I think you can see from the selection that's on your screens, he doesn't get that far with those 656 pages. There are other manuscripts in which Fairfax's poetry appears, at least 3 in the British Library that are important in terms of his manuscript poetry. And there's another one that was at Leeds Castle, and I believe now is in the Brotherton collection. So coming back then to sort of where we go with this. Oh, sorry, I meant to move forward page. Hang on. There we go. Even in his selection of Fairfax's poetry, what I find wonderful is that Reed, actually having produced this, completely dismisses its value. He says, "We have no discovery of a neglected genius, and there will be no call for the complete works of Thomas Fairfax." So forget the rest of this paper. Do you know what, though? It is entirely true that none of Fairfax's poetry is exceptional. And yet I've set myself the project of transcribing the manuscripts and analysing the content. So there's a fair question of why. Fairfax is certainly no Thomas Traherne. But there is one, I think, important connection, and it's one that Tom Kane points to in his edition of Mildmay Fane's poetry, where he compares his discovery of Fane's manuscript poems to the 1903 discovery of Traherne's unpublished poetry. And he does so not because Fane's output is aesthetically exceptional, but because Fane's manuscript poetry presents a largely new writer who was forced to confront one of the most climactic and influential sequences of events in early modern history, the Civil War and the execution of Charles I. Fane, of course, was a royalist who went into retreat in his Northamptonshire estate during the Interregnum, and there are some parallels with Fairfax, the parliamentarian, in that respect that I'll come on to. But it's really the kind of the element of recovery scholarship that informs Kane's edition that really sets a precedent for my project and for the case for attending to the unpublished poetry of Fairfax at all, I would say that the case for attending to this poetry is actually the greater than Fame's, because Fairfax simply had a higher stake in the events of the Civil War and the Interregnum than Fame. And his influence on those events was the greater. This, after all, is Thomas Fairfax, 3rd Lord Fairfax of Cameron, Commander-in-Chief of the New Model Army during the English Civil War. In the mid-17th century, not only in England, but well beyond, pretty much everyone knew Fairfax by reputation. He was, as Milton puts it, Fairfax whose name in arms through Europe rings, filling each mouth with envy or with praise. And as I've become more and more interested in Fairfax, I have, of course, tried to get hold of lots of engravings. Most of the ones on eBay are from Germany and Holland and France. His image was being reproduced well outside England. This is then a parliamentarian who actually was at least as important as Oliver Cromwell, or at least he was until around 1650. And this paper really is part of me taking up Andrew Hopper's call for scholars to pay closer attention to this figure, closer attention to the record of a life that really, since the Civil War, and particularly, obviously, since the rise to power of Cromwell, that record has been rather generally sidelined by a Cromwell-focused history, to the extent that where there's that wonderful film of Cromwell, where there's a certain point when somebody says, "Send in Tom Fairfax," and I sit there going, "You don't send in the commander-in-chief, he sends you in." So there's a sidelining that's gone on, but I'm not going to focus on Fairfax's years as a military leader. I'm going to focus on the even more neglected years of a generally neglected life, which are the 1650s. And although he was on the winning side of the Civil War, there were ideological differences that led Fairfax into political, social, geographical, and physical isolation during the Interregnum. First, he refused to sign the King's death warrant in January 1649. Then in 1650, when the Council of State determined to send an army into Scotland against the Scotch Covenanters, he resigned his commission. And as Fairfax began his rise to power in the position of Lord Protector, remember he kind of took that title in 1653. So as that momentum is building, it was partly building because Fairfax entered a position of political retreat in his Yorkshire estates. Of Denton, his estates were Denton and Nunn Appleton. Nunn Appleton was his preferred residence, and he really was mostly there. So those are some grand pictures for you. I couldn't find an earlier one of Denton, but I'm sure if I keep looking, I'll uncover it. By the way, you can only really break into Nunn Appleton these days. There's some excellent pictures of people who have broken into Nunn Appleton and seen the inside, but it's a really inaccessible estate. Fairfax also appears to have gravitated towards a quieter life for the sake of his physical and mental health. In his resignation letter, he refers to debilities both in body and mind occasioned by former actions and businesses. Now, obviously, these debilities are in part a handy excuse for him extricating himself politely, but they still existed and were recognised enough by Fairfax as factors that affected his life. Now, during the 1650s, Fairfax was not in lockdown as we know it. But his movement during the Interregnum certainly wasn't free. For one thing, he had to keep a fairly low profile. Some had seen him as the natural choice to lead the country after the regicide, and others had really feared that outcome. And the pamphleteer Marchmont Needham, when he was masquerading as a royalist, because he sometimes turns up as a parliamentarian as well, just journalism, he in early December 1648 clearly stoked some of these fears that Fairfax is rising to too great a power, when he records that when Fairfax arrived in Whitehall in December of that year, he had done so as if he meant to king it. And he brought along with him 4 regiments of foot, part of which became courtiers, as well as 6 regiments of horse, part of which made bold with the king's stables and turned out the horse guards to the houses to grass, out of the houses to grass. So although Fairfax left London after his retirement, it's not surprising that Cromwell remained conscious of the potential threat that he posed to his own power. Fairfax may have retreated to Yorkshire, but of course Yorkshire was the county in which Fairfax had distinguished himself in many successful military campaigns. And there's Nunn Appleton, his estate, really right at the heart of things. And it's clear that Cromwell did regard Fairfax as a threat throughout the interregnum. He had his letters, for example, intercepted by his spy master, John Thurlow. Fairfax's retirement then is a political retirement. It's also, of course, part of the subject matter of Marvell's Appleton House, where Marvell sort of questions what legitimate otium is, what constitutes retirement, what's retreat, what's service, what's earned leisure, and what is simple idleness. And those questions, of course, remain relevant when we're looking at Fairfax's own poetry. But I want to pause on Marvell just for a moment, because again, he is our literary significant route to Fairfax. And one of the most interesting things is that despite questioning the position of Fairfax in retreat, the picture that Marvell paints is not immediately recognizable as one of loneliness. He talks in that passage about the stately frontispiece of poor, also about the idea that there are rooms which have daily new furniture of friends. We also find references to friendship in Gibbs' Life of Thomas Fairfax, where she writes that the Fairfaxes were popular with their neighbours. Since the days of Elizabeth, they'd been noted for keeping a good table. Strong ties of friendship bound them with the Slingsbys of Scriven, the Vavasours of Hazelwood, the Ingrams of Temple Newsome, and their cousins, the Belaceys, were regular visitors at Nunn Appleton. And I think both of those characterizations require a bit of extra thought. The first thing I'd note with the Marvell passage is that the apparently comfortable idea of companionship is undermined in 2 distinct ways. A furniture of friends might at first seem rather lovely, but to have daily new furniture of friends begins to sound slightly unsettling, exhausting even. Also, which friend do you sit on? Nunn Appleton also, Marvell tells us, was built as an inn to entertain its lord a while, but not remain. So the place's association with inns, I would say, again, emphasizes passing traffic, something where contact is rather short-lived and insubstantial. And I think this conference has also reminded us that you can be lonely with people buzzing about you. Gibbs' references are problematic in other ways. She refers to the days of Elizabeth. Well, that's completely different Fairfaxes for a start. There are also obviously differences between what the Fairfaxes were doing in the 1630s and 40s and their condition during the interregnum when the older generation had died off. And again, between that and the Restoration. So there's a kind of a sweeping generalization. There's also the question of distances. Temple Newsome is about 20 miles from Nunn Appleton, about the same distance from Denton. Scriven is again about 21 miles from Nunn Appleton and Denton. Newburgh Grange, which is where the Belaces were from, is about 50 miles plus from Nunn Appleton. The Belaces, by the way, are particularly interesting connections. I don't have time to deal with them here, but if anybody wants to know about the Belaces and the Fairfaxes, I'm happy to talk about those. But what's clear is that none of these people are just around the corner. Any visiting requires traveling. And it's also important that while Fairfax could receive guests, he was actually increasingly reliant on others for doing the visiting. And this wasn't just because of his political isolation. And it perhaps to some extent, as the Interregnum wore on, it wasn't even mainly because of his political isolation. He was increasingly physically isolated by disability, and that was the result not only of years of battle in which he picked up all sorts of injuries, but also gout. Like the fact that years of battle, but also good living caused an amount of isolation. And by 1664, he had completely lost the use of his legs and was confined to a wheelchair. But the buildup of that, you can see it even in his resignation letter. But I think there's something more to point out here, and that's that having friends about the place doesn't necessarily counter the type of loneliness a person in Fairfax's position might feel. And that kind of loneliness is one that I think is directly relevant to the way in which this conference has been framed and the way in which it's encouraged self-reflection. After yesterday's papers and discussions, I actually revisited my own paper because I realized that my experience of Fairfax has actually been developed by what you might call my own experience of loneliness. I'm not going to get deeply confessional on you, but I started to transcribe and photograph the Bodleian and British Library manuscripts way back in early 2020, sort of squeezing in quick research trips between a very sociable BSEX conference and the start of the second semester. And that was obviously before the pandemic took off. It was also before I was made redundant by the University of Portsmouth, which I found out last September. In early 2020, transcribing Fairfax's poetry was a matter of academic curiosity. A month or so ago, when I returned to that material that I'd started to collect before and started to kind of upload transcriptions onto my newly formed website, my relationship to the topic had changed. And what I'd say is I'd begun to understand a different kind of loneliness that I think Fairfax would have experienced. I still had friends, albeit everybody was at a kind of lockdown distance. But after 16 years working for an institution, I'd experienced what I'd describe as a professional loneliness. I was no parliamentarian general, but I did begin to understand what it must have felt and what it must have meant for Fairfax to have contemplated his new position at the start of the Interregnum, at a distance from that forward momentum of events of which he had been a key part. He was also separated from people we might think of as work friends, and he was watching Cromwell rise to a position of Lord Protector in a sphere over which he now had apparently no control. Now, academic sort of life is obviously of a slightly different nature to Civil War soldiering, although not as much as you'd think. But in both cases, I think identities are tied up with professions. They're tied up with the way in which we think about not only our kind of our sort of self as a person who works in a particular capacity, but also kind of belief systems. They obviously come into academic life quite strongly. So being made redundant made me understand what, as I say, I couch as a professional loneliness that is tied up with concerns about loss of identity, loneliness caused by what feels like loss of an old self. Now, my affiliation that I recorded for this conference is Northumbria University, but Northumbria is actually only where I picked up some part-time hourly paid work. I used that, and this is another thing where I thought it's important to reflect on this. Why did I use that? It wasn't a long-term affiliation. And I used it not because I felt it was substantial, but because I wanted to appear to other academics as if I belonged. Working on my newly created website, the website where I'm making Fairfax's manuscripts accessible, is partly about reinstating that academic identity, an identity in crisis after redundancy, after the institution removes your staff page, that takes away those layers of identity that you take for granted. So typing in HTML code and all of that, it can seem a little bit mindless, but it also feels like a regaining of some element of control. It also requires a discipline, a kind of discipline that occupies the mind and that has a very clear outcome. And it strikes me, and it particularly struck me after yesterday's papers, that during the Interregnum, Fairfax did something not completely dissimilar. He turned his hand to something that might seem insignificant, but that required discipline and would have enabled him to chart progress of a different kind from what he was used to. He spent a good time writing, and he did so especially through turning his hand to poetic translation. And we've seen other examples in this conference of translation in isolation as a kind of a function to get over a lack of connection. For example, there was a paper on Elizabeth I from McKelly yesterday. The selection of Fairfaxian poetry that I've uploaded to my website so far is pretty limited. It's what I was able to transcribe and at least get photographed before lockdown. So this is very much a work in progress. Most of the material I have is from the Bodleian manuscript. And at the front of that manuscript are all Fairfax's psalm translations. So that's most of what I've been focusing on. But unlike Reid, I don't assign these translations a secondary status. Translating the Psalter is a notable choice, I think, for a man facing a newfound isolation. It is, as Helen's paper was really kind of just engaging with, it's a biblical book fundamentally linked to matters of disempowerment and exile. My focus on Fairfax's poetry also challenges the bias that often leads us to prioritize sort of pamphlet and epistolary evidence when we're looking to kind of understand a historic personage, rather than to think in terms of what we might find in their creative outputs, particularly translations. But as Fiona McCall notes, for many in the mid-17th century, the emotional response to life-shattering events in the 1640s was to find a bleak expression via other outlets, generalized sermons, meditations, poetry, satire, usually circulated in manuscript. And of course, while I'm not going into the kind of the circulation of Fairfax's manuscript, he clearly produced a fair copy. That's the copy held in the Bodleian. And so therefore, there is a sense that he expected somebody to read this. Moreover, as Hamlin observes, what makes early modern metrical psalm translations most intriguing is not their accuracy, but their imaginative boldness in their errors. And Philip Major also has suggested that Fairfax could have been reading his own circumstances into Saint-Amand's The Solitude. And I'd say more than that. I find, increasingly there are sort of indications of a relation between the translations and Fairfax's circumstances, which I don't consider now to be extraordinary. I consider it would be extraordinary if we didn't find that. And as I transcribe and upload Fairfax's poetry, I've also been mapping out blog type responses, and they'll be the kind of the next part of what I'm uploading. I'm realizing that discipline of transcription and coding opens up a mental space in which I can start to reflect and piece together my own thoughts. And that's why I think it's so obvious now that, of course, Fairfax encodes his own ideas at times within his poetry. I think it's impossible not to enter that space and start reflecting on your own condition. So in due course, the idea is that, I'll get back to the libraries, back to the manuscripts, and start to uncover more traces of what I see as Fairfax's bodily, geographical, political and professional restriction and solitude in these translations and poetry more widely. But what I want to do for the very last part of this paper, and this is where I finally actually get to his poetry, but I've told you it's not exceptional, so don't fall off your chairs. What I wanted to do is just introduce you very briefly to two of Fairfax's psalm translations, and they're Psalms 10 and 31, neither of which are in Reid's edition, which again is not unusual. Most of the Psalms aren't. So Psalm 10, first of all, the things that really struck me when I was comparing different translations alongside Fairfax's was that both the Hebrew original and the Geneva translation initially refer to the wicked as a kind of collective, a collective wicked. They are the wicked people by implication. But for Fairfax, the wicked is transformed right from the start into he seeks my ruin. It's a singular he, a pursuant who sets baits to entrap, and who is specifically targeting the speaker. The speaker transformed, I think, here from David into a more Fairfax type speaker. The Geneva Bible also follows the Hebrew when it later switches from the collective wicked to a he. So we do move into that specificity of he does this, he does that, albeit later than in Fairfax. But again, we find something new in Fairfax's translation, where the Geneva text reads, he saith in his heart, I shall never be moved nor be in danger. Fairfax talks of status. He thinks his station's sure. Where the Hebrew speaks of settlements or villages, the Hazarim, where this wicked he lies in wait, and that's then translated as villages in the Geneva. Fairfax removes the village context. He presents a man lurking in holes, plotting, a much more, I think, sinister figure. Fairfax's plotter, I would say, also shows marks of the political world of the mid-17th century. The Hebrew of verse 10 emphasizes the animal power of the wicked who fall on their prey with kind of claws. In the Geneva, that's transformed into a figure that crouches and bows and then uses might, physical might, to defeat the poor. Fairfax's plotter, though, like a political or courtly flatterer, uses fawning gestures to catch those that he specifically watches. And while I don't want to kind of over-egg this, I think that sense of people who seem to be kind of flattering or seem to be being nice to you, but are also watching and waiting, and does rather suggest the kind of sense that Fairfax himself might have felt when he was in a kind of a standoff in political isolation, but knowing that he's being tracked and watched by Cromwell's spies. Finally, and very briefly, Psalm 31. And in his translation of Psalm 31, Fairfax again transforms the Hebrew's plural enemies into a singular enemy who lays secret snares. He also provides a particular emphasis in response to the Hebrew and Geneva Psalms reference to loss of neighbours. Fairfax writes, to him that hates me, I a scorn do seem, amongst whom I lived, oh, this doth grieve me more, to bear their shame that had acquaintance been. And that is an elaboration, certainly. And I think in these details, what Fairfax is doing is straying imaginatively from his source in a way that we recognize as part of the tradition of Psalm translation. And he's revealing his own, I think, rather than the Davidic contexts and feelings. Finally, then, such textual deviations, I would say, provide new insights, not just into a key moment in the mid-17th century sort of political sphere, but also into the state of mind of a key figure in mid-17th century English politics. They don't reveal a great poet, but they do reveal the once great General Fairfax, using translation as a means by which to reflect on past political friendships and his new professional isolation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I can see lots of silent clapping around the room.